Hi, I am Mary Poplin with Boris FX, and today we're going to talk about office hours. So we do office hours every 1 p.m. on Tuesdays, Eastern Standard Time, and we're going to talk today about how to remove tracking markers. Now, the shot I'm going to show you was something that someone sent to me, a user, and they said they were having trouble with it. And there's a couple of reasons they were having trouble with it. It's a little bit challenging. One of the reasons they were having trouble with it was that it actually isn't a really good remove shot. It's better as a patch or as paint work. And I'm going to show you how a couple of different ways to tackle this shot. And spoiler alert, they all involve roto. So, we've talked about that before. Everything involves roto. Now, I will see your questions in the chat and I will respond to them. I've injured my hand. I'm not going to be typing anything. I am not to be trusted around sharp objects in the kitchen. And so I will not be typing. I will be answering as usual by voice. But also I'm moving a little bit slow with the mouse because I'm having trouble right-clicking. Bear with me, and I will maybe move a little bit slower today than normal. I'm looking in the chat right now, and I'm seeing a lot of love, which I appreciate. I'm really glad that you guys are enjoying these office hours so far. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to cut over to my screen, and we're going to show you what I'm looking at. All right, so the user needed to remove these tracking markers from this lady's belly. Now, that's a little bit of a challenge for a couple of reasons, all right? Now, one of the reasons that this is a problem is because this is really easy to remove, but this texture is really specific. So we've really got to make sure when we do work like this that we realign the texture. The other problem is, I can't stress enough, don't use these kind of tracking markers on people if you're going to pull the fabric in with the tracking marker, because that's going to make your life harder. Put a mark on there, put a washable paint, put a chalk dot. They make fabric chalk. They make fabric markers, by the way, that are really great. So, I mean, I sew, and I'm sure a lot of people don't know this, but there are markers that you can get in a sewing supply store that will put down a mark that you can just spray water on and it disappears. So make sure if you're going to do tracking markers on somebody's clothes that you're being smart about your tracking markers. This is not an ideal tracking marker. All right. It's also really big, which you don't need. You really need more than one, and you need them to be not so big. So the other problem is that down here, right over the bottom of her belly, where her finger is, we've got an occlusion, we've got a lot of shadows, and we've got the shadows cast from her hand. Now, all of these mean that this is really not a good place to do a remove. It's better to do a patch here or paint. And then you're going to have to obviously roto new shadows in and roto the fingers out. And that's just the way it is. We don't really have a way to crop stuff out and remove in a way that I find satisfying. So even if we did roto to the edge of this hand and get all of this finger, perfectly rotoed, we're probably going to leave 1 or 2 pixels on the background. That's going to contaminate our remove no matter what we do. So I just want to point that out before we get started. Now, I am going to talk a little bit about some of the processes here that you can use. So first things first, and I've talked about this before, if you've got an area that's moving similarly to other areas, right? And this area is moving similarly to this area. What we can do when we want to remove something like this is we can come in here and we can just make a quick roto shape around whatever object that we want to remove. And we can do this. You can do this in Nuke. You can do this in Fusion. You can do this in After Effects. You can do this. I think you can even do this in an editor as long as you have something that recognizes roto shapes in an editor, or you can do this instead of Mocha, draw a shape around it and use Mocha to apply the shape. So we could do that too. But what we're going to do is we're going to subtract this. Okay. And now we have a little hole right here in her torso. Okay, I'm going to duplicate this layer and drag it underneath. Now, I'm going to delete this, right? Mocha right off of this, and I'm going to delete the mask right off of this. Okay, so now I've got a masked layer and an unmasked layer. And my unmasked layer I'm going to just change the position of this shirt, okay? And now we can do something like just feather the tar out of it. So if we come over here to our feather, we can feather this like 80 pixels. You know, actually, let's do 50 pixels. Even 40, because I can see that I'm still leaving object on the background. Now we can move this around until it looks the way we like. So obviously this looks a little bit better. The problem with this is this doesn't line up the texture, okay? And this does not, this will move with the object, right? Because it's just a shape and it's pulling from the same place, but it won't match lighting and it won't match other areas. Now we can also use something like the remover. So for those of you that have never used the BCC remover before, you can use the BCC remover to do a clone like this. You can also use silhouette to do something like this. So you could do a paint and silhouette. You could also use some built-in paint tools inside of After Effects to try to do this. Now, not everything in that is a good option. And part of the reason is, like I said before, if you look here, part of the issue is that we've got this texture here that really needs to be matched. So if you were going to do something like this, you might have better results just using the straight up clone tool or using silhouette. In silhouette, you can track this and paint it. You're going to have to paint much larger than you would think because of how this fabric is pulling. But I will show you how to do a remove for this one patch right here. So let's go ahead and I'm going to delete this and let's make a new file. Let's do Mocha. Let's do Mocha Pro. Drag and drop this right onto our timeline. Okay. And now we're going to go ahead and launch Mocha. All right. So in Mocha, I'm going to zoom in. We're going to track this area. I'm going to draw a nice big round spline around the area that I want to remove, just like this. And we're going to make sure that we grab that area where the texture is being pulled. And look here, look how badly that's being pulled. I don't know if you can see. I'll zoom in a little bit closer. It's hard to tell what can be seen on, over the internet, but you can see there's a significant V shape here, and all the way out to the edge, we're still getting that pull on that fabric. Don't do something like this when you're trying to do a tracking marker. Okay, now if we want to track this and remove it, okay, we're going to need to track this area. So let's go ahead and take our little shape and let's track translation, scale, rotation, shear, and perspective, and let this track through. And it'll be a pretty fast track, all right? Now, once that track is complete, I'm going to just go ahead and duplicate this layer really quick. We're going to call this remove, and we're going to call this BG. Okay, so now we have a layer above and a layer below, okay? The layer below needs to be slightly larger, so let's just take the remove BG, go to frame 1, and let's just expand our shape just a little bit. And now we have an inner shape and an outer shape, okay, that describes the motion that's happening on this tracking marker, okay? So now what we can do is we can do a remove. Thank you for the love in the chat. That's very nice. Let's go ahead and select the layer that we want to remove. And I want to talk about how the remove process works. So the remove process normally says, here are my foreground pixels and here are my background pixels. I want to use all of the background pixels to replace these foreground pixels. And as long as you can see behind the foreground pixels, Mocha will remove it automatically. What happens when you can't see behind these pixels? Well, I can see that I have a piece of tape here. That means that tape is static. It's not moving anywhere. There's nothing moving behind it. So we can't judge what this needs to be replaced with. That's where clean plates come into play. So I go over to my remove and I am going to say, hey, create a clean plate. All right. Now, so we're going to create a clean plate and I'm going to create a clean plate right here. We're going to call it clean plate 0 and save. Okay. Now let's go over to Photoshop and let's open and let's do our clean plate right here. All right, so here's our clean plate. Now, I need to remove these pixels. I can paint this out in Photoshop. I can paint this out in Nuke and save it out as a still frame, but that's kind of a big waste of time to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and draw all around this object really quick. And I'm going to say edit, fill. Let's do a content aware fill in Photoshop and see what we get. Okay, that is sort of acceptable, but I can see, because this is a really specific fabric, that it's not totally acceptable. So now I'm going to have to use my Band-Aid tool, my patch tool, heal tool, okay? And we're going to just heal this texture up just a little bit because we want the texture to be correct. All right, so once again, we'll just heal this texture up and we're gonna make sure that it's aligned in a way that makes sense, okay? Now, it doesn't have to be perfect out here at the edges because it's not going to replace that part, but it is important to get it right where it's at in the middle as much as possible, okay? So once again, here and here and there. All right, we're never gonna get it 100% perfect, but we are gonna get it as close as we can. You know, we can even do things like this. We can take this shape over here where it's round because we've got a focus problem. And we can duplicate this. So we can, let's do a feather and let's actually, we want to go to select. We want to go to, where is my feather? It is right in here, modify feather. Okay, we want to do like 50 pixels. All right, and then we want to copy and paste, and we want to edit, and let's do a transform, and let's flip this horizontal, and now we can patch over this side a little bit better. So sometimes it's better to just use a whole big patch because that way you can blend it in a way that makes sense. So same thing here, we'll just take another big patch from this section right like this, and we'll do a select, modify feather, and we will copy and paste, and we will edit, transform, flip horizontal, and patch this in. So when you've got a texture like this, where you've got this moire pattern that you've got to hide, sometimes it's better to just use a big replacement piece rather than try to get in there and paint it all individually. So Lisa Ben asks, can we use content aware fill? Well, you can see that I actually just did that. And unfortunately, my results did not look very nice. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to flatten this, okay? And we're going to save it. So now I've got this patched shirt. And if we zoom out, you can see that that does not look weird anymore, okay? And you can see this moire pattern that's happening, right? We want to make sure that we're matching that pattern, or your eye is going to be drawn to that every single part. No problem, but I will show you what that looks like. Let's go to well, when we used content aware fill, what happened was, I'll just show you on this one more time so edit, fill, content aware. You see how it gets blurry and mashy in the middle? That's why I didn't use that. So, I mean, I tried it to start with and it didn't look right. So we're going to save this, and now we're going to jump back over to Mocha. So the reason content aware didn't work is because content aware, while being a very smart, very excellent algorithm that gets you part of the way there, unfortunately, we do know that even very well-trained imagery reconstruction still needs a human eye. And in this case, we need a human eye to match that pattern. So let's go back over to After Effects and Mocha. All right, and now inside of Mocha, what we're going to have is we're going to have this clean plate input. So let's edit this and make sure that is exactly where we took it from. So if you look right here, you can see that this says clean plate input 0. 0 is the frame number, so that number should always match over here. If you ever do this and you see something that says frame all or something like that, don't. Make sure that it's exactly the frame that you took it from when you're doing a remove, or we will not be able to replace those background pixels correctly because they'll be offset by whatever frame offset is happening, okay? So let's go ahead and hit OK. And let's use clean plates exclusively. This is extremely important. Right down here, use clean plates exclusively. When we have an object we cannot see behind, we must use clean plates exclusively, because if we do not, what we will end up with is a problem area. And that problem area will try to replace these background pixels with the background pixels that are already in the shot, okay, instead of the background pixels that we made in our clean plate, okay? So we can also change illumination modeling. Now I'm going to do linear illumination modeling on her stomach because her stomach is moving and the lighting is changing. And we're going to leave this on auto step. Auto step will look 112 frames before, 112 frames after, but instead of looking at every single frame to try to do the remove, it'll just look at my clean plate. So let's just go ahead and hit render forwards. And now what we end up with something that looks pretty decent, okay? So we're going to hit save, and we're going to hit close, and we can render this right back to our timeline. So let's click our remove and render. Now you can see that I still need to feather this back in because we're getting kind of a hard line. That's no problem, all right? I can do one of a couple of ways to do this. I can go into my mat and I can apply the mat, and I can take visible layers, and let's do a remove only, okay? And now I can feather this, okay? Or I could do something like create AE masks. And so with create AE masks, if I turn my apply mat off, I can go into my mask and I have a lot more control. So I can actually do a little negative pixel expansion here. We could do a feather of like 50, all right? And we can apply that way. If it's still not working because of some After Effects quirks, we can just cut that mask and we can go to layer, new, solid, okay, and we can paste that mask, all right, and now we can use that as an alpha matte right there to replace our, oh, why are we in the wrong place? Oh, I know why, because we moved the transform. Okay, well, we'll figure that out later. Anyway, the point being, there's many, many different ways to skin this cat. So I want you to know that this is still not the best way to remove this. The best way to remove this, in my opinion, is a series of patches. So let's take Mocha and delete it. Let's not delete it because it's got all of my information on there. Let's make sure our shot is completely, yeah, it's back where it's supposed to be. Okay, let's take our old shot and delete it because it's underneath. And I want to start over from scratch because I want to show you the way that I would really do this shot from scratch, okay? Now, if I were going to redo this shot from scratch, first things first, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a really rock solid patch for every piece in this footage. So right here, down at the bottom of her belly, we need to do another patch, okay? And we need to patch all of this over where her stomach is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just grab a big round section right here. We're going to, once again, go to selection. We're going to go to modify. We're going to go to feather. Okay, we're going to copy this and paste it. And then we're going to rotate it into place. Okay, just like this. And patch it right over the top. Okay, and if we feel like it needs to be a little bit more opaque, we're going to duplicate that layer a little bit until it gets more opaque. All right, now that's a belly patch that will work, but we're going to have to change the color of this. So we're going to go to, I want to say it's Control U. Yeah, we're going to darken this just a little bit so it fits better in the space. Okay, and we're going to patch right here on over her hand as well. So we're going to duplicate this, and we're going to go to Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal. Now, I want you to notice one other thing that I'm doing here. I am way over patching the area that needs to be replaced. Now, what do I mean by over patching? Okay, I mean that I'm covering up her fingers and thumbs and everything else when I'm doing my patch. And the reason for that is because if I do not over patch this area, what will happen is when I'm trying to do my, my finished shot, this hand is going to be in the way. I don't want that hand in the way, okay? I want to replace this area with something that I can put a new shadow back over. Okay, and that means I've got to make the patch larger than I would originally think. Okay, just like, there we go. Let's just, yeah. All right, move that here. Perfect. All right, so that's going to be my patch for this belly area. It's large and it covers up the whole hand. That's important, okay? So now we've got this entirely clean plate that we can use to replace this information. All right, let's save it. Layer, flatten image. Let's just save it, and then let's go over to our host. Now, in this case, we're still using Mocha, so we're going to use Mocha for all of this. I'm going to take this footage, and I'm going to layer, and I'm going to pre-compose. I'm going to move all attributes into the new composition, and I'm going to adjust the composition duration to the time span of the selected layers. Okay, this is important because I just saw a post on the forums where somebody was having trouble aligning their work in After Effects or any other host. But in After Effects specifically, when you are working with a very long timeline, you need to adjust the composition duration to the time span of the selected layers. What that will do is if you have trimmed this in, it will adjust it to the time span that you've trimmed it to. That's important because if you have a super long piece of footage or a footage cut from an edit or something round tripped from Premiere, you need to enclose it so that you can start to do visual effects on it. All right. Now, does anybody have any questions about the first part of the remove that I talked about or patching before we move on to how I would patch this shot in reality? And I am checking the chat. And I don't see something, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to phase 2. All right. So in phase 2, what we're going to do is we're going to take Mocha and we're going to drag and drop it onto our pre-comp, just like this. Okay. Now, in my pre-comp, I'm going to launch Mocha. All right. And we can do this a couple of ways. Now, this is a really round area to patch. So we might want to use something like Power Mesh to get the roundness of this track. And we can do that if we want. The way we would do that is I would select this area that I want to track. I would select perspective and mesh to track the power mesh. I would use uniform and I would generate a mesh that way, hit render forwards. Okay. Now, this will track the area on her belly. And we can patch this in with her breathing, okay? Her subtle breathing that you can see is happening here in the shot. We can patch this in using a power mesh patch, or we could patch it in using a corner pin. I'm going to try using our power mesh patch right here. All right, so, but I'm going to correct it a little bit. If I look here at the end of my shot, I feel like we're wobbling too much. So I can actually adjust this in a couple of ways. I'm going to actually increase the smoothness of the power mesh, and I'm going to retract that just like this. Because I feel like we were slipping, and the reason we were slipping is probably that we were allowing the planar track to not have as much influence as I would like it to have. So I'm going to increase the amount of influence that the planar track has on this area, because pregnant bellies are actually pretty hard. If any of you have ever been pregnant before, I don't know what the demographic makeup of this group is, but a pregnant belly is pretty hard. So it's pretty firm, and it doesn't have a whole lot of like that secondary motion that you get from, like, say, a wiggle that you would get with softer tissue. It's actually kind of like a giant taut water balloon, and your body's barely containing it. So because this is at the bottom of her rib cage and the top of her belly, we're going to use that, and I feel like that looks a lot better. All right, now, what I can do is I can use an insert here. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to close it. And then in my project, I'm going to import a file, and that file is going to be my clean plate. All right, so here's my clean plate. I'm going to drag and drop it right under my timeline. All right, inside of my effects controls, I'm going to go to module renders and I'm going to select my clean plate input as my patch. Okay, so now I'm going to check insert composite and render. All right, and now if I launch Mocha, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to do an insert for this. We're going to insert top belly. Okay. All right. So this is going to be our top belly patch. My insert clip is going to be my insert layer. And on frame 0, I'm going to just go ahead and align the surface. All right. So now that's my aligned patch. Inside of my insert module, I can say, hey, I want you to use the mat for the top belly. And so now we're just using that mat. Now, the nice thing about this is I can take this shape, for example, and I can feather it. So I can go to my Uber key and I can add like a 30 pixel feather and just add that right to my shape. So now my shape has a lovely feather to blend back in, okay? And we can also do things like select the inner edge, excuse me. We can select the inner points just like this. And we can move them in just like this around the area that we want to patch. Okay. So now I've got a nice soft shape that I can use to put this back in. Now I also want to check this power mesh warp option. That will now warp this insert along with her power mesh. So if I turn this off and hit play, I can see that looks pretty good. You know, if we want it to blend even better, we can go ahead and turn our overlays back on, and I can do things like pick the edge and blend this back up better into her sides and belly. Because we're picking the edge, just like that. All right, and I feel like that looks a little bit better. It does. Okay. So that is how I would do that patch. But once again, and I really want to stress this because I mentioned this at the beginning, this shot really and truly should have been using tracking markers that were marker dots that would be a lot easier to remove and less destructive than a piece of tape that pulls on the edges of the fabric and makes the remove that you have to do very large to cover the space. Also, if you're using Mocha, this kind of shot really did not need tracking markers. You could have just used Mocha to track that area. And if you needed to put tracking markers on it for another piece of software, I just want to show you something really quick. You can always do something like this. In your insert clip, go ahead and make a grid, okay? And now you've got tracking markers that any other piece of software can read. So just when you're working on shots like this, be really thoughtful about not making more work for yourself, because this shot is what I would call making more work for yourself. Okay, and I hope that makes sense. So Joel Pitrell asks in the chat, I wonder what the markers were intended for in the first place and what was the intended effect. Well, the user who submitted this is in the chat, and hopefully he can answer that question. Because I'm not actually sure what the end goal was on this shot, but thanks, Joel, for asking. I'd love to know. But the thought process to me, really, this could have been done and should have been done with something like fabric markers. Now, how do we patch the bottom? Okay, now we have this big problem with the bottom of her belly. Okay, and this is actually pretty difficult. All right. So one of the things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to really think about how we can fix this shot. So I know that I'm going to have to roto shadows, and I know those shadows need to move correctly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this and close it. Okay, and we're going to do one more instance of Mocha because I like the way that this looks, right? And because let me launch Mocha. I think I closed something. Let's start later. Go to the belly, insert clip, insert layer, Let's go to insert, hit render. Let's see what that looks like. All right. Save and close. All right. But what I do want to talk about is I want to talk about how to do the bottom of the hand. So we're going to drag and drop this right onto the bottom of the hand. The clip, and we're gonna patch this bottom part. So let's launch Mocha. Okay. So now, if we want to remove this tracking marker down here, okay, this is 100% not something that the remove module is going to really enjoy doing. Okay. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to come in here and we're going to roto this hand. So first things first, I'm going to just grab a little thumb shape, and I'm going to grab a finger shape here, okay? I'm going to take both of these shapes, all right, and I'm going to start rotoscoping. Now, I'm going to be a little bit lazy about rotoscoping this. I'm going to actually use Power Mesh to roto these, okay? And the reason is because I'm just not really very interested in doing all the funky shape changes I would have to do to track the end of the thumb, the middle of the thumb, and the back of the thumb. I'm just going to have it work as one. So we're going to use uniform, generate mesh, and we're going to use uniform and generate mesh. All right, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let both of these track through. Let's call this thumb, and let's call this finger, okay? And let's go ahead and hit track through, track. All right. So what we're doing here is we are letting the power mesh track through. And what that's going to do is you see that's following the bend of the thumb. Let's stop for a second, move down and zoom out so you can really see what we're doing here. We're going to correct this just a little bit and ask it to keep tracking. And you see it's really getting the subtle secondary motion of that thumb without me having to do that. All right. Very good. So I'm going to take this shape, I'm going to go back, delete that keyframe, go all the way back, and now we're going to change the keyframe on that thumb. I'm going to hide my power mesh because I don't need to use it anymore. And you notice that I tracked on the inside of the object while I was using the power mesh. That is because power mesh is very sensitive, and whereas the Mocha planar tracker loves edges, power mesh has a hard time differentiating edges. So when I track with power mesh, I always track inside the object. When I track with just the base planar tracker, I always track in what is basically, what's the right word? I always track outside the object just by a couple of pixels. Now, here's the thing about this thumb, and here's why this is super cheating. I really only need this to look a little bit like the thumb because I don't actually really have to roto this thumb very well. I just need it to kind of match the shape of the thumb so I can put it back over the top, but also it doesn't need to be perfect. And the reason it doesn't need to be perfect is because I'm going to use this to generate a shadow basically. So here we are. All right. Now, same thing for the hand here. Let's come over here. Let's track this finger just like this. Now this I have to be a little bit more careful about. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to use the Add Points to Spline tool. And I'm going to get a nice edge right here on the edge of the finger where it goes over this part, this problem area. All right. But if you look, well, let's just delete this keyframe. If you look, what I'm really trying to do is I'm just trying to make sure that when I put this back over the top, it looks correct. All right. Now, let's just correct that shape a little bit more. Bring this in here. All right. All right, watching somebody rotoscope is a lot like watching paint dry, but here we are. Now, I will probably have to go back in and roto that fingernail, but I don't want to do it right now. I just kind of want to show. I'll do that if we have time here at the end. Okay, so I've got these two areas to remove. The next thing that I need to do is I do kind of want to roto these fingers here on the bottom. So let's turn this off and let's just make a nice big roto shape down here for these fingers. And we'll just do a nice big shape for that. All right, so that's going to be my hand shape. Let's call this hand. Bring it underneath everything and let's track it. Let's track with shear. We don't need to track in perspective. We might not need to even track in, well, let's try perspective and see what we get. I don't like it, but in general, I tend to recommend not tracking perspective when you're doing, so let's actually just try all the way back down to rotation. That'll work. Okay, now let's hit track backwards. Here we are. We're getting hung up on her thigh a little bit, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. Now we could go in and try to adjust this, like right here. And we'll adjust it over time. I'm going to pin this into place using the Activate Quick Stabilize mode. All right, and using Activate Quick Stabilize mode, I'm just going to make sure that I can correct this roto shape over time, just like this. And all we're going to do is just keep correcting this shape over time like we do with any other roto shape. Just like this. Now, ideally, I would have already baked this roto cake for you. But as I said earlier, I have injured my hand a little bit, so we're just going to kind of go through quickly. All right, here we are. Perfect. It's not perfect, but anyway, you get the idea. So the idea is that what we're going to do is we're going to use these to rebuild a shadow. All right, so there's my lovely roto shape for my fingers. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to use the Uber key, and I'm going to build out this edge a little bit, just like this. Okay, and now I should have something that I can create a shadow from. All right. So what we'll do here is we'll take our finger, thumb, and hand, and we're going to expand these just a little bit. So we're going to take this shape, and now that it is how I would like it to be, I'm going to duplicate it, and we're going to expand it a little bit. So I'm going to use my Uber key, and we're going to pull this shape out into roughly what the shadow shape looks like. And because we already did that work, we get a shadow. Let's delete this keyframe here. And yeah, there we go. So now we end up with something that looks a little bit like a shadow. Same thing for here. We're going to duplicate this finger. We're going to use the Uber key. We're going to pull this shape out just like that. And same thing here for the hand. We're going to duplicate, and we're going to use the Uber key and pull this shape out. All right, and so now I should have several shapes that represent shadows over this area. Okay? So The other nice thing about this is those shadow shapes can work as pretty good holdout mats. So now I can track this little belly piece underneath. So let's take our shape and let's draw it around the bottom of her belly here. Now notice I am going to track much more of her belly than just the area that I want to get. Okay, I want to grab this whole section. The reason for that is I have a lot of contaminating data over here. I want Mocha to see that this is not really moving a lot. So we're going to call this belly track or bottom belly track. Okay, and we're going to move this underneath everything. And the reason for that is, remember, we hold out areas that are above in the layer pile. All right. So we're always holding out shapes when we drag something to the bottom of the layer pile. If we roto from the foreground to the background, we'll always have our occlusions rotoed, okay? And shadows are just as much occlusions as a physical object, and that's really important to note, okay? So now, let's scrub through this shot. Yeah, that's gonna cover everything really nicely. Let's go ahead and track with perspective and hit track forwards. Let's turn our surface tool on so we can see what our track is doing, because remember, the surface tool is what the track is doing, and the shape is where the track is looking. Let's go ahead and hit track forwards. And let me turn my auto stabilize tool off. There we go. So we're tracking that belly, and we're going to patch it. All right, so let's go ahead and use our insert clip as an insert layer. Save and close. All right, and so now in our module renders, we're going to select our insert layer. We want our clean plate, and we want insert composite. We want to render this as an insert composite and launch Mocha. You can see that we're rendering the whole plate. We don't want to render the whole plate. What we want to do is we want to go to frame 0. We want to align the surface just like we did last time. All right. And now what we want to do is we want to use the Uber key. We're just going to move this shape over our tracking marker. All right. And now we're going to go into our insert and we're going to say, hey, use the mat for bottom belly track. All right. So there's my mat. And we can even go in with our same Uber key. We can do that edge feather as well back in over the top. All right. So now if we save this and we close it, we're going to render that patch back over her belly. Now I can see that I actually need an oversized patch for this. Well, actually, no, I don't, because her hand is over that section and Roto will cover it. So never mind. I thought that I did. Yeah, so I can see that I'm going to have to do Roto to put this back in. That's no problem. All right. What we're going to do now is we have to rebuild that shadow over the patch area. So let's go to Layer, New, Solid. All right. And let's select like a dark color here. Hit OK. And let's go to Multiply and put that over the top. And let's bring this down to like 15, maybe 20%. Okay. Just because what we're trying to do is we're going to rebuild shadows. We want it to be darker, but we don't want it to be crazy darker. Okay. So let's take our Mocha and let's go into our mats and let's create AE masks. All right. And so now I have all of my AE masks. I can take my AE masks and I can drop them onto my shadow area. All right. So I can see that in my masks, I'm not going to want the bottom of my belly track, but I am going to want this amalgamation over here. Let's select these and let's add like a 60 feather on them. Okay. So now what I've got, if I hit play, is I've got a patch and I've got my shadows moving over my patch. All right. Just like that. Now I'm seeing too that what we're going to want is we're going to want to rotor the hand back over the top. That is also no problem. Let's hit duplicate, bring this to the top. I'm going to take my Mocha. I can go into my mats. Let's go into visible layers. Let's get rid of all our copies. Hit OK. All right. And let's go to matte. Actually, I'm in the wrong one. Let's go into our matte and let's actually go into our render as well. Let's turn off our render on this. Okay. And now we want our apply matte. Okay. So now I've got my hands back over the top and we can come in here and we can feather this like quite a bit. Okay. Or I don't want to feather it that way. Actually, let's feather it 0. All right. So now I've got my roto back over the top. All right. And I can take this and I can just either select this little area that I've patched and blend it back in with the shadows and the roto, or I can do something like roto out this leg and roto out the bottom over the top as well. So I could just take my original footage, let's delete everything off of it, you know, and I could say, hey, I just want you to subtract. All right, and let's feather this back over the top. So this kind of layered patching technique is something that you would do if you were going to try to replace something with a shadow. Now, obviously, this is not perfect. I need to go back in and perfect my roto. But this is the basic workflow that I would do to fix this shot. It will take longer because I have to go in there and I have to do a more perfect roto situation to get every edge of this hand and nail and get the shadows nailed. But the technique is there. All right. Now, once again, I have to stress, when you are shooting your shots, please be thoughtful about the way you're shooting. This is unnecessarily hard, and it didn't have to be. It could have been something that was just a breeze to fix. And in fact, it could have been something that could be fixed with a BCC remover tool if anyone had just thought about how the cloth interacts and thought about the areas that they're trying to replace. You never want to put tracking markers where you're going to have tons of occlusions, okay? Because that is a super pain to get rid of. And for some reason, it seems like wherever you put a tracking marker, always somebody will walk over that. Let me just cut so I can talk to you for a second. All right, so it just seems like, I don't know if you've seen a lot of green screens from things like some of the Marvel movies, but like, it just seems like no matter what you do and how you plan your shot, no matter who the VFX soup was on set that day, and how they had actors blocked out, somehow, somewhere, sometime, some actor's hair, like Thor or something, is going to be blowing breezily over a tracking marker in the background. Okay, whenever possible, when you're planning your shots. And for this, you can tell that this is a planned shot. This is something that somebody worked on, you know, where they were doing most of the camera work and other work themselves. You know, when you are planning your shots, please be thoughtful about how you're setting up your scene. So for things like this, once again, can't stress enough, use stuff like the washable fabric markers that you literally just spritz water on and the fabric marker disappears. You can use chalk in a similar way. For things like on people's faces, don't put X marks on somebody's faces. Put a series of little dots that you can just blemish remove right out of there with a tool that's specially made for it, like the BCC remover tool, or even that would be easier for a remove. With removes, the larger your remove has to be, the more margin for error there is. And the problem too is that occlusions do not work with removes. I mean, they just don't. So you will have to do a series of patches and shadow rebuilds if you want to do something like that. Now, I do have some other tutorials that are way more in-depth on rebuilding a rebuilding a shadowed object from scratch. It's on the side of a car. I can, if somebody asks, I can probably try to remember to put that in the comments of this video. It's a lot more in-depth than this, but this is the technique I would use, and it's really important to make sure that you're rotoscoping your objects correctly and thinking about your shots. All right. Yeah, somebody also says use green screen markers of a different hue. Yes, obviously you could also do that. The problem with this is that this is not really a good keyable shirt because of the pattern on it. Even though you probably can't see the pattern is there. And in high def, you will see it. The other issue is that this is just pulling on the fabric, which you don't want. And the other issue is that there's no reason this needed to be as big as it was as a tracking marker, depending on what you're trying to track. So I hope that's answered some questions about different ways to do this. We showed you the removal process where you can literally just patch and move the object underneath. That works really well for things like facial hair. If you've got a let's say you have somebody with kind of a patchy beard or they've got a fake beard on and you can see the line here. You can use that same technique of moving just a line of whatever's underneath that up to cover the area. And then just using clever roto and transform to fix that. You can also get away with that for things like any mustache fills in for some fake mustache. We had a guy that was patching up a Santa a couple of years ago on our forums, and that worked for him really well. So just make sure that, you use the technique that's appropriate for the job. So you could use that. You can also use that technique for patching water. Now, the other technique I showed you was the remove tool and using a clean plate and all of that. And the thing is that's not the best solution for this shot for many reasons. We showed you how to do some power mesh roto, which is fun. But the main thing that we showed you here was how to rebuild a patch in stages, which is the bottom layer, which is going to be your object without shadows, your patch without shadows. You're building your shadows back over the top, and then you're putting the original object back on top of that. Now, that is a proper workflow for this kind of thing. A lot of people just go ahead and do that in something like Silhouette, where they can take the object, stabilize the object, paint on the object, and then they can use Roto to rebuild the shadows. So that's something else you can do. You can always use Roto Paint for this sort of solution. You don't have to use a big patch from Photoshop. All right. I hope that's answered all your questions. If you have any more questions, you can email me at maryp@borisfx.com. I hope you found these office hours useful. If you did, please like and subscribe. That helps us. It helps you because it lets you know when we are doing these live streams. They're always going to be Tuesdays at 1 p.m. unless we tell you otherwise because something got rescheduled. And have a wonderful day, guys. It was really good interacting with you. And thanks for asking your questions in the chat. Send me your shots if you have anything that needs to be troubleshooted. All right. Bye.